Michel Bitbol. He is presently Director of Research at Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, École Normale Supérieure, Husserl Archive in Paris, France. He received an MD and a PhD in physics and an habilitation in philosophy. After a start in scientific research, he turned to philosophy of quantum mechanics. He then studied the philosophy of mind in collaboration initially with Francisco Varela, and developed a conception of consciousness based on an epistemology of first-person knowledge. From the very beginning, his work has been guided by what Edmund Husserl called the mothers of knowledge, namely the dynamics of lived embodied experience, but also the life world of laboratory objects and practices. He's the author of Schrödinger's Philosophy of Quantum Mechanics and several other books on quantum mechanics and philosophy, epistemology, and consciousness. So let's welcome Michel. Merci.
Thank you very much. So I want to start from this wonderful quote from Zarathustra, from Nietzsche. The creator, he said, wanted to look away from himself. That's why he created the world. You could just revert the proposition and say, okay, since we are so absorbed into the world, we tend to look away from ourselves. And it's exactly what we want to revert now. How can we become of this blind spot? How can we become aware of the blind spot of science? That's my question. It's quite difficult when we are completely absorbed into the objective elements of our experience, but maybe there is a way. Oh, okay. How should we do? Yes, good. Okay, first of all, we have to characterize several varieties of blind spots. Some blind spots are quite easy to see. For instance, this one, the so-called blind spot by vacancy. When you have just a black area into your visual field, you say, oh, by contrast with respect to the rest of my visual field, this is a hole. This is something missing. So it's quite easy to see it. The second case is more interesting, and it's the typical blind spot of the retina. There is something missing, but on the other hand, you do not see a hole instead of what is missing. You just see a continuity with the rest. And you only guess that there is something missing by contrast with something that appeared earlier. So it's the case for the retinal blind spots. You have done already this exercise yesterday of trying to see the black dot, and sometimes it disappears, but there is no hole in the visual field. And there is a third possibility. It's the so-called aware spot. So let's do an exercise suggested by Douglas Harding. You show with your finger everything. You need, this is a table, this is a screen, this is a ceiling, and so on. And you turn your finger and point here. And what do you see? At the surface, you would say, I see a finger. But in fact, this is a typical mistake of one who tries to see the finger, but not the moon that is shown by the finger. And what is shown by the finger is what? I see no quality here. I see something empty and free to let everything else arrive to me. And I see, especially, I feel the origin of awareness. The origin of my awareness of this finger is where the finger points, okay? So we can realize that there is something special here. Okay, this idea has been expressed beautifully, as you all know, by Wittgenstein, and it has been quoted by Robert. Nothing in the visual field allows you to infer that it is seen by an eye. Is it true? Is it really true? At any rate, you can, before we answer this question, you can generalize. Nothing in experience allows you to infer that it is experienced. What do you see? Objects. Do you see experience? No. Do you realize that objects are experienced? Usually not. And Nishida Kitaro, the Japanese philosopher, generalized or extended these remarks to science, to objective science. He said, as soon as one has adopted the standpoint of objective knowledge, the knower doesn't enter into the visual field. So it's the same idea, but applied specifically to objective knowledge. Now, how do we usually realize that all these things are seen by an eye, my eyes? Okay? Usually, well, we can use a mirror and get a third-person view of ourselves, especially of our eyes. This is the picture at the left. But what about the visual field itself? Can it reveal anything about its being seen by an eye? Yes. Why? Because there is a structure of vanishing point and vanishing lines converging towards the vanishing point. The vanishing point is, the expression in the visual field of its being seen from somewhere, namely from an eye. What about experience now? The case of experience is more tricky because there is no way to get a third-person view of experience. And therefore, you only have experience seen from the first-person standpoint. Yet, there are features that are typical of this experience. For instance, the analog of vanishing point is called by phenomenologists such as Heidegger situatedness, the fact that everything is experienced from somewhere. And this from somewhere shows that it's not just a sort of blank experience, it's experience seen from somewhere. So there might be a way, very difficult way, because usually you don't do that, but there might be a way to realize that all these things are not just things, but they are experienced. And this move from the things to the experience to the experience of the things, this move backwards is called by Kant, by Husserl, and so on, the transcendental deduction. Okay, so it was Kant who invented a new use of the word transcendental. You know that in the Middle Ages, and still in the usual meanings of words in English, transcendent and transcendental are almost synonymous. They mean beyond. Beyond what? Beyond appearances, beyond experience. Something that explains experience, but it's not directly experienced. But Kant distinguished between the two meanings. He said, as soon as we posit with the unconditioned, outside of all possible experience, the ideas become transcendent. So this is the usual meaning of transcendent. But Kant uses transcendental in a completely different sense. It's not what is beyond appearances, but what is below appearances, and becomes the condition of possibility of these appearances. It's from where appearances appear. That is the new sense of transcendental by Kant. Now, what can you say about the transcendental? Can you speak of it? Can you use words to describe it? Can you characterize the condition of possibility of it? And Kant says, no. This, namely, the transcendental, cannot be further analyzed or answered because it is of such condition that we are in need for all our answers and for all our thinking about objects. So the transcendental itself cannot be an object of thought. It is a condition for any object of thought. And yet, we can do what Kant called a transcendental deduction, because as soon as we realize the structure of our experience, we can derive some properties of the condition of possibility for there being an experience of a set of elements that we can take as if they existed a part of us. The as if clause is very important in Kant. Now, let me list a series of statements about the transcendental. In fact, the transcendental is something that is, or not a thing, of course, but it's very well known, and it has been well known for a very long time. For instance, these quotes are drawn from the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, and they characterize the Brahman. The Brahman is precisely the transcendental in the sense of Kant. It is never seen, but it is the seer. It is never heard, but it is the hearer. It is never thought, but it is the thinker. It is never known, but it is the knower. So this is very clear. Okay? It is the source of knowledge, the source of seeing, and so on. And the question is, how should he know the knower? With the implication that it's impossible to know it, because the knower cannot know itself. And yet, these sentences deny the impossibility, since someone, one day, the author of the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad realized that there was something from which everything is thought, seen, heard, and so on. And the author called that the Brahman. Now, there are more modern quotes. For instance, this one that I love by Ernst Cassirer. Consciousness is a goal to which all knowledge turns its back. It's still a goal. We want to know something about consciousness, but each time we try to do so, we are moving away from what we want to know or to study. It's a wonderful paradox. And also this very clear statement by Michel, a French phenomenologist. Consciousness cannot be shown, for it is the power to show. Where is consciousness? It is from where everything is shown. From where the show is given, I would say. Okay, maybe I can skip some of these sentences, including the wonderful one by Giovanni Gentile, an Italian philosopher, and turn to Husserl. So according to Husserl, the ego, he was speaking of an ego, and maybe it's an improper way of putting things, but it was Husserl's manner at the time of his so-called transcendental turn. The ego who bears within him the whole world as an accepted sense. Okay, the world is a sense for the transcendental ego, according to Husserl, and who in turn is necessarily presupposed by this sense, is called transcendental. Here is the definition that Husserl gives of the transcendental. And now, you know that Husserl discovered Buddhism about 1924. So he was given a book, a translation of the Sutta Pitaka in German, and the author of the translation asked him to give a comment, a preface. And in his preface, Husserl wrote the following sentence: Buddhism looks purely inward, in vision and deed. It is not transcendent, but transcendental. So Husserl, maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong, at any rate, he recognized immediately in Buddhism something that was amazingly akin to his phenomenology. Buddhism has no transcendent God, but it explores the transcendental field of consciousness. How do you do that? How do you land into this field that is to be explored? To do that, you have to perform the epoche. The epoche is a Greek word meaning suspension, cessation. Primarily, it is suspension of verbal judgments. This idea was posited long ago by Greek thinkers such as Pyrrho, the skeptic, and the Stoics. And according to them, it was necessary to suspend any judgment about the value, the beauty, and so on of things, just to reach ataraxia. They are as they are, and we don't have to judge them. You certainly know that Piro was very much influenced by his Indian knowledge. You know, he traveled to India with Alexander the Great, and he brought back some Indian ideas. But in phenomenology, you don't only suspend the verbal judgments, you also suspend the pre-verbal judgments. Namely, when you see something like that, you don't necessarily say, this is beautiful, or this is gray, or this is a table. You immediately take it as a table, because you think, okay, I can use it to put my things, to work on it, and so on. So immediately, even before you have pronounced the word table, you recognize this as a possibility of using it as a table. And even that is to be suspended by the epoche. So what you obtain then? We'll address the question later. What is left after you have suspended even the pre-verbal judgments? At any rate, it's very important to understand, against many contemporary judgments, that the epoche is not just a rhetorical element of Husserl's philosophy. You know, many of sometimes my colleagues say, oh yes, that's just a sort of verbal element of his philosophy. No, according to Husserl, the epoche is dramatic, is something that changes suddenly your state of consciousness. It's not something cheap, you know. He says, phenomenology implies a complete self-transformation, which can be compared to a religious conversion. You see things completely differently when you have performed the epoche. This epoche is radical, it's immediate, and so on, but it's similar in scope to Descartes' doubt, the famous doubt about everything, about things, and so on. The only difference is that in Husserl, you don't doubt things out there. You just suspend any judgment about them. You don't say they don't exist. You don't say they exist. You just let them be as they are, namely here, apparent, nothing more. But then, when you have lost thus the world by the epoche, you can conquer it anew in a universal self-examination. What does it mean? It just means that when you analyze what is left after the epoche, you see all the processes by which we tend to reconstruct our belief in an external world. So from here and in this experience, you have all the material that is needed to reconstruct a set of beliefs about things out there. But then it's very important to understand that once you have suspended the judgment about things that you see in your visual or sensory fields, you have to do something in order precisely to examine the modalities of the reconstruction of your belief about these things. To do that, you turn your gaze and you examine these acts of consciousness out of which your belief in external things is built. But there is a paradox of the epoche. On the one hand, it looks a very difficult act to perform. People are, some people say, no, I could never perform the epoche. It's too difficult. It's not natural. My everyday common sense way of being is completely averse to that. But in fact, it's an illusion. In fact, it's very easy to perform the epoche. The epoche is always performed, and we don't know it. We don't realize it. This was said, for instance, by Michel, but maybe even more strikingly by Jean-Paul Sartre in his book, The Transcendence of the Ego. He said, the natural attitude imposes a huge effort and a long-term education to be performed. It's an effort, precisely, a symmetrical effort, which fits quite well with the description of Robert a little bit earlier. It's a symmetrical effort to extract invariance from experience and to stabilize an experiencing pole, called the ego, placed in front of things, okay? It's a symmetrical effort to extract the subject and the object. When this effort, for some reason, relaxes, or when it becomes too painful to perform, suddenly, poof, we are again in our natural state, which is the state of the epoche. And, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a whole novel called Nausea in order to describe this accident, as he called that, the accident of everyday life, which is to fall suddenly to the epoche. Suddenly his hero, Roquentin, realized that there was no past, there was no medieval events and so on that suddenly popped out from the book he was reading in the library, but there was just, black characters written on white paper. Suddenly, poof, finished. All this transcendence, all this me dreaming of the Middle Ages, finished. He just see, just paper, black dots. That's it. It's the kind of accident that may happen when you perform inadvertently the epoche. So now about the science of nature. Okay, so the missing element in science is precisely the realization that all these objects are seen from somewhere. So from somewhere in a very, elusive sense, namely from this famous aware spot, but also in a very concrete sense, all these things are seen from our everyday world, the life world, okay? Electrons, protons, quarks, and so on, what they, turn out to be is just inferences that we do from marks on our the screens of our apparatuses in a laboratory, essentially. So this is the life world. This is the sudden collapse into the laboratory after we have dreamt of this wonderful universe of quarks, forces, quantum fields, and so on. So according to Husserl, Galileo was the one who performed the trick, who suddenly was hiding the origin of knowledge. So, of course, he discovered something very important, how to mathematize natural phenomena. But on the other hand, discovering that was also a way, has at least the implication of covering something, of concealing something. He concealed, he concealed the origin of this knowledge by trying to show how you can derive the life of the knower out of the knower's intellectual byproduct, namely a theory, a physical theory. So, according to Husserl, the subjective relative, namely the true origin of knowledge, the life world, the aware spot, and so on, is supposed to be overcome because you have something, you have discovered something that you think is more fundamental than your departure point. However, the subjective relative is not something irrelevant that must be passed through, but that which ultimately grounds the theoretical validity for all objective verification. So whatever problem you have in your knowledge, and suddenly you think, that doesn't fit, there is a problem, and so on, what do? You stop projecting your attention onto the set of theoretical objects you have, and you come back where you are. Where are you? In the laboratory, observing dots on the screen. And then you think, is my picture adequate to the dots I'm seeing now in the screen? That's what occurs at each scientific revolution. Suddenly things, scientists say, poof, finished all this theory. I have to think everything again from what is given to me. For instance, it's a case in Einstein's creation of the special relativity, when he says, I no longer believe in ether, time, space. I just see that I measure length and measure duration with clocks and so on. That's it. Same for Heisenberg, reduction to observables. So there is this collapse of beliefs at each scientific revolution. It's very important not to forget that. The blind spot of the science of nature was also expressed beautifully by Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty wrote the following thing. He said, okay, classical science takes the world as an object under a neutral and external gaze. But, he said, even then, even at that moment, nature resisted. Why? Because nature could not be posited entirely before the scientist. There was something that was resisting. It was the body of the scientist, the own body of the scientist. This own body that had, as Ivan told us, a double face, seeing and seeing. Okay, I can see my body, but I see also I realize that it is where from the seeing is done. And then Merleau-Ponty denounced the reaction of classical science to that. The reaction was to transform my body into an object. He said, no, it cannot be done entirely. This is wrong, and this leads to problems. We'll see which problems after that. And Michel-Henry put that in a very dramatic way, because he thought that the forgetfulness of this departure point, the abolition of life in favor of a model of the world that is dead, basically, is the original sin of our civilization, what he calls the origin of barbarism. So he wrote a book that is translated into English, Barbarism. Okay. Can science, is it just a problem for, our humankind as a whole? This forgetfulness of the origin of knowledge? Or is it also a problem for science? And I claim that it's really a problem for science. And I claim that virtually all the problems of foundations, of the so-called foundational problems of science, arise from the blind spot. One of them has been wonderfully tackled by Gödel. It was the problem, of the dream of Hilbert of justifying mathematics only formally and so on. That was broken by Gödel. But all the other problems of science outside mathematics, in physics especially, arise from this blind spot. So it's not completely innocent. We should not completely be happy by saying, okay, I can't forget it because science is so efficient. I don't care about the origin of science. The explanatory gap has been quite well explained by Ivan. But I can summarize it by saying that the problem is, how can we give an objective explanation of the subjective? You immediately see the problem here. And especially how to recover subjective experience after having intentionally banished it in the process of objectification. We have created science by excluding ourselves, and then we want to recover ourselves out of the byproduct of this exclusion. This is just absurd. But the same for the measurement problem of quantum mechanics and the second principle of thermodynamics. We want to explain that Schrödinger cat is seen dead or alive, whereas its quantum state represents it as dead and alive, and this is a problem for everyone. It has, it has been a problem for 1 century now, almost 1 century. But the problem is immediately seen as absurd because that means that we want to recover experience actuality after having intentionally banished it in favor of a pure statement of possibilities and probabilities. What is the quantum states, after all? As, for instance, Chris would say, it's just a statement of probabilities that is useful to us to bet about results of measurement. So how do you want to recover the actuality of an event out of this statement of probability and possibility? The same for the second principle of thermodynamics. So many physicists wanted to explain irreversibility out of the time-symmetrical laws of physics. Mostly it's time-symmetrical. And here again, the problem is how to recover the experienced irreversibility after having intentionally banished it in favor of a metric of clock readings. What is called the time of physics is not the complete time, is time minus duration, minus the sense of evolution, minus the so-called A series of McTaggart. So there is a flow here again. We want to recover something that has been excluded from the beginning in order to build the science we ask to recover that. Usually people, in order to say that finally, for instance, will obtain an explanation of how experience can arise from the objective world, they give a sort of inductive argument in science, namely in the history of science. They say, okay, we have reduced heat to mean kinetic energy. We have reduced life to biochemical networks, reduced time to dimension of Minkowski space, reduced color to wavelengths, reduced thought to mechanisms, computers, and so on, reduced information to a probabilistic formula, the Shannon one. And therefore, one day we'll succeed to overcome the last mystery, which is experience, lived experience. Okay? A good example was Daniel Dennett. But in fact, this inductive argument is wrong, basically wrong. Why? Because each time you see one of these reductions, the reduction is not reduction of something subjective to something objective. It's reduction to a global macroscopic variable to a set of microscopic variables. But the two sets of variables are objective variables. For instance, let me take heat, which is so popular as an example of what is to be reduced in order to get an explanation of consciousness. What is reduced to mean molecular kinetic energy is not the feeling of hot or cold. It's not that. It's just a thermometer reading. Namely, macroscopic thermodynamics can be reduced to a certain extent to statistical thermodynamics, but not the feeling of hot and cold. And so on. You can do the whole list. In each case, you see that what is reduced to a certain model is an objective variable. And therefore, experience cannot be seen as a sort of asymptote of this series of reduction, because experience is systematically excluded from every such reduction. So experience is the origin and the horizon of research, and it's not something that is in the focus of this series of reductions. So let me give some examples. I don't know. Tell me how long I have. Okay. Okay, maybe, so I will treat just that case and not the measurement problem, but it's the same issue. So you know the famous objection of Loschmidt to Boltzmann. He said, okay, but you derive the second principle of thermodynamics that has to do with irreversibility out of a set of purely reversible equations, the equations of classical mechanics. So it's impossible. You cannot do that. Therefore, Boltzmann answered, okay, I know. It's not that there is a complete irreversibility, but that the reversibility is much more probable than the reversibility. And in order to demonstrate this, he introduced two subjective symmetry, one symmetry breaking principle that was of subjective origin. Okay? He introduced the hypothesis of molecular chaos on the ground that we cannot know all the positions of the particles. The same for the coarse graining that was introduced by Gibbs. It was exactly that for that, because we cannot know all the microscopical movements. Okay, then there were so many developments, but one of the main trends in the research, in the foundations of statistical thermodynamics, was to find, to locate desperately what is the objective source of the irreversibility. So many attempts were made, cosmology, the theory of chaos, and so on and so on. And each time people say, okay, but there is still a subjective element here. For instance, in the chaos, it's a problem. It's just because our knowledge cannot be infinitely fine-grained. Okay. But then you realize that after all, what you desperately want to obtain at the end of the process of elaboration of a physical theory might have been present at the beginning of it. And you suddenly realize, as Isabelle Stengers noticed, that the physical laws that assert the equivalence between before and after have been made possible by measurement operation. But any measurement apparatus denies this equivalence. Why? Because you use the measurement apparatus, there was no result before, and there is a result after. Here is an asymmetry, a basic asymmetry. Before you had no information, then you have an information. Or as Bohr would say about the thermometer, the thermometer is an instrument that is based on the assumption of an irreversible transfer of heat between the bath and the element of the thermometer. So the very measurement of temperature, which is the basic fact of thermodynamics, is due to presuppose what we want to obtain at the end of the process, namely irreversibility. So I skip all these ideas about quantum mechanics. Maybe I can elaborate on this slide, because it's exactly the same in quantum mechanics. We want to obtain actuality out of the set of possibilities. I told you that before. And what we do, in fact, is project actuality into the set of possibilities. All these attempts at solving the measurement problems are exactly that. They are projections of actuality, namely the precise value of a variable obtained during a measurement, onto the structure of possibilities. For instance, Bohm. Bohm, what does he do? What is a hidden variable? It's the projection of a pointer reading onto a certain variable, such as the position, that is supposed to exist independently of measurement. So he projects this actuality onto the model. Then he says, but in fact, when I put a measurement apparatus, the quantum potential of this measurement apparatus modifies the position that I've postulated. But that's just a disturbance, okay? But the position exists. to me, it seems that it's just a projection of what he wants to obtain, namely that the variables of things bear the mark of actuality that is typical of what we measure, of what we get into the laboratory. Same for GRW. What does he do? He sees that the Schrödinger equation doesn't contain any term of projection, of reduction of the wave packet, and so on. So he imposes it on the equation itself, introduces a stochastic term in it, and says, that's what I wanted to get, namely a description, an objective description, something outside of me, of this actuality. But this actuality has been imposed artificially. And then people try desperately to justify it by gravitation, by quantum gravity, and so on. But it's only an a posteriori ad hoc move. The first move was just to say, actuality, I don't see it in the set of possibilities that is described by the Schrödinger equation through the evolution of a psi function, so I impose it on it. And so on. Everett is a wonderful example of that because, first of all, he deploys the structure of possibilities, of possible measurement outcome, into, a multiple worlds structure. So, in fact, he immediately gave actuality to the possibilities themselves, even before picking one. And then very interestingly, for instance, for what Jenan was saying, Everett says, okay, but these spots that I wrote on the blackboard, namely, eigenvectors, superposition of eigenvectors that I associate to many worlds. Each spot has a possibility of being endowed with a standpoint, the standpoint of someone who, by inhabiting this world, would see this result rather than another one. So here he projects the actuality into the possibility models, and he extracts one of them as, say, the one that has been observed effectively in the laboratory. So here is the process by which people try to hide the blind spot. They project the blind spot inside the model, and they mistake the symbol they have introduced in the model for the thing itself, namely for experience. Okay, so I have to stop here, even though I had a conclusion, but I think it's enough for discussion.
Thank you very much. Right, if you have questions, we can do it during the panel discussion, which will be this.
Yeah.
You want to ask now? Yeah, sure, go ahead. You're going to be in the panel, so you can also ask there. I'm just worried about time again.
I'll be quick. I'll try.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I have a question about Kant. I was very pleased that you started with Kant, and it made me realize probably I should have given a different kind of talk this morning because I have another paper on Kant and the origin of perspectivism. The question is, you talked about the transcendental deduction in particular there. And I wonder what your view is on the sources of the standpoint and the importance of the point of view of the human agent in Kant, because this is something I'm very interested in, and for my work I've been looking primarily at the ideas of reason as imaginary standpoint, where he uses exactly the metaphor of a vanishing point that creates the deception as if there were objects behind the mirror, but there are no real objects. But nevertheless, they play a regulative role. So I just wonder what you think about that.
Yes, of course. It's the idea of a regulative ideal. Namely, we try to elaborate about our reason a conception of what is beyond phenomena, essentially the noumenon, and the noumenon is nothing else and nothing more than the vanishing point of all our efforts towards reconstructing it from the effort of reason. And the reason here, and of course you know that Kant reproaches reason for going beyond what it can do by having purely abstract reasonings instead of just making the synthesis of phenomena by pure understanding. So the reason, and he has a beautiful metaphor. He says reason goes beyond the field of its legitimate pretensions, and this is similar to a bird who, having seen that he or it flies better in rare air, would think that fly would be even better in emptiness, in void. So I think he reproaches reason for going too far with respect to its legitimate field of operations. Thank you.